They handed me food stamps like I was begging on the street corner, while upstairs in my attic sat a collection worth more than their mortgage, their cars, and their entire lives combined. My own son's wife smiled that plastic smile as she explained how government assistance worked, never knowing that the faded stamp albums gathering dust above her head contained the rarest postal treasures on earth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Gladys Henderson, and at 73 years old, I thought I knew what rock bottom looked like. I was wrong. Rock bottom wasn't losing my husband Walter to cancer 3 years ago, or watching our savings disappear to medical bills, or even having to sell our family home in Portland and move into my son Marcus's guest bedroom. Rock bottom was sitting at their kitchen table while my daughter-in-law Stephanie counted out government assistance vouchers like I was a charity case, all while lecturing me about budgeting and personal responsibility. The irony would have been laughable if it wasn't so humiliating. There I was, being treated like a financial burden by people who drove luxury cars and took weekend trips to wine country, while 3 floors above us sat my late husband's stamp collection that neither Marcus nor Stephanie knew the true value of. Walter had been collecting stamps since he was 12 years old, inheriting his father's albums and spending 50 years building what he quietly called his retirement insurance. I used to tease him about his obsession with those tiny pieces of paper, watching him spend entire weekends with his magnifying glass and catalog books, mumbling about perforations and watermarks like they were ancient scriptures. When Walter died, I couldn't bear to look at those albums. They reminded me too much of Saturday mornings when I'd bring him coffee and find him hunched over his desk, comparing postmarks and organizing protective sleeves. The collection had been moved to Marcus's attic when I relocated, along with boxes of Christmas decorations and old furniture that Stephanie deemed too outdated for their modern aesthetic. I assumed the stamps might be worth a few $1,000s at most, maybe enough for a nice vacation someday, but certainly nothing life-changing. Walter had always been modest about money, never one to brag about investments or flash expensive purchases, so I figured his hobby was just that, a hobby. Marcus worked in pharmaceutical sales and made decent money, enough to afford their 4-bedroom colonial in the suburbs of Sacramento with the granite countertops and smart home technology that Stephanie loved showing off to her book club friends. Stephanie herself had never worked a day outside the home, spending her time managing their twin daughters' packed schedules of soccer practice, piano lessons, and tutoring sessions that cost more per hour than I used to make in a day as a school secretary. They weren't struggling financially, not by any stretch, but they had developed this narrative that I was draining their resources simply by existing in their space. The transition to living with them hadn't been smooth. Walter's medical bills had eaten through our modest savings account, and the sale of our house barely covered his remaining treatments and funeral expenses. I came to Marcus with nothing but my Social Security check and a few personal belongings, grateful for a roof over my head but increasingly aware that my presence was seen as an inconvenience rather than a blessing. Stephanie had a way of sighing whenever I asked to use the washing machine or needed a ride to the grocery store, as if my basic needs were unreasonable impositions on their busy lives. The food stamp conversation began 3 months after I moved in, during what Stephanie called a family financial meeting that felt more like an intervention. She had printed out budget spreadsheets and grocery receipts, highlighting items she claimed I was consuming that went beyond my fair share of household expenses. My Social Security covered the small rent they charged me for the guest room, but apparently, my coffee consumption and preference for name-brand cereal were throwing their entire household budget into chaos. Gladys, we need to be realistic about the financial impact of having you here, Stephanie said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she used when explaining obvious things to the twins. Your fixed income just isn't covering your actual living expenses, and it's putting strain on our family budget. I've done some research, and you qualify for several assistance programs that could help bridge this gap. Marcus sat beside her nodding along like a bobblehead, avoiding eye contact with me while she laid out her case. This was the same son who used to crawl into my lap during thunderstorms, who I drove to every baseball practice and school play, who called me crying from college when his girlfriend broke up with him. Now he was treating me like a business expense that needed to be optimized. I don't need government assistance, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I can buy my own groceries. Stephanie's laugh was sharp and dismissive. With what money, Gladys? You're already 3 months behind on contributing to utilities, and last week you borrowed $40 for your prescription medications. This isn't about pride, it's about practical solutions. The truth was, I had been struggling financially, but not because I was irresponsible or lazy. Walter's illness had required me to take unpaid leave from my job to care for him, and by The time he passed, my position had been eliminated in budget cuts. At 70, finding new employment wasn't exactly simple, especially when most employers took one look at my resume and saw decades of experience as a liability rather than an asset. My Social Security payments covered basic needs, but the cost of living had outpaced my fixed income in ways that made every month a careful balancing act. But there was something deeper happening in that kitchen conversation, something that felt less like family concern and more like strategic maneuvering. Stephanie had been making comments for weeks about the valuable real estate of the guest bedroom, mentioning how it could be converted into a home office or craft room if it weren't occupied. She'd started leaving real estate magazines around the house, featuring articles about in-law suites and aging-in-place modifications, as if she were building a case for why I needed to consider other living arrangements. The food stamp application process was designed to be humiliating, and Stephanie seemed to take particular pleasure in walking me through each form and requirement. We spent an entire afternoon at the county assistant's office, surrounded by tired-looking families and elderly people who reminded me uncomfortably of my own situation. The caseworker, a kind woman named Patricia who couldn't have been older than my granddaughters, treated me with more dignity in 10 minutes than my own daughter-in-law had shown in months. "Mrs. Henderson, based on your income and living situation, you qualify for $215 per month in food assistance," Patricia explained, sliding the benefit card across her desk. "This should help with your grocery expenses and take some pressure off your family budget." I stared at the plastic card with my name printed on it, feeling a shame so deep it physically hurt. This wasn't who I was supposed to be at 73. I was supposed to be the grandmother baking cookies for school fundraisers and taking the twins to movies, not the elderly dependent collecting government benefits while living in my son's spare room. Stephanie, however, seemed thrilled with this development. On the drive home, she chattered about how this would solve everything and how I could now contribute more meaningfully to household grocery shopping. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had already planned out which stores accepted the benefits and which aisles I should focus on to maximize the value. Her enthusiasm felt grotesque, like she was celebrating my humiliation as a personal victory. That night, I sat in the guest bedroom that had become my entire world, looking around at the cream-colored walls decorated with Stephanie's leftover artwork from their last redecorating project. My personal belongings fit into 2 small dressers and a corner of the closet that smelled faintly of mothballs and disappointment. Through the thin walls, I could hear Marcus and Stephanie discussing their weekend plans, debating between a wine-tasting trip and a shopping excursion to San Francisco, as if money were no object at all. The next morning, Stephanie handed me a grocery list written in her precise handwriting, organized by store sections and annotated with preferred brands and quantities. "I thought we could make this a regular thing," she said brightly. "You can handle the grocery shopping with your benefits, and I'll focus on meal planning and preparation. It's a perfect division of responsibilities." Standing in the cereal aisle of Safeway, clutching my government benefit card and Stephanie's detailed shopping list, I felt invisible in a way that went beyond simple embarrassment. Other shoppers moved around me with purpose and dignity, making choices based on preferences rather than restrictions, while I calculated unit prices and compared generic brands like a mathematician trying to solve an impossible equation. The card worked exactly as promised, deducting from my monthly balance with the same electronic efficiency as any other payment method, but somehow every transaction felt like a small surrender of the person I used to be. The routine became established quickly. Every Tuesday, I would take the bus to the grocery store with Stephanie's list and my benefit card, carefully selecting items that maximized nutritional value while staying within the monthly budget she had calculated down to the penny. The bus rides became a kind of meditation, 40 minutes each way where I could sit quietly and watch Sacramento pass by the windows, remembering the freedom of having my own car and the simple dignity of being able to drive myself wherever I needed to go. It was during one of these Tuesday shopping trips, about 6 weeks into the food stamp routine, that I overheard a conversation that would change everything. I was waiting in line behind 2 elderly men discussing collectibles, and one of them mentioned selling his father's stamp collection for enough money to buy a condo in Florida. "You wouldn't believe what people pay for the right stamps," he was telling his friend. "My dad had this one sheet from 1918, some airplane thing, and the dealer said it was worth more than my house." More than my house? Can you imagine? I stood there holding my government benefit card and a cart full of generic groceries, suddenly remembering Walter's excited phone calls to collectors across the country, his careful research into auction houses, and the way he would sometimes disappear for entire weekends to attend stamp shows in distant cities. I remembered him talking about investment pieces and museum-quality specimens, language I had dismissed as hobby enthusiasm but was now hearing with entirely different ears. That afternoon, instead of going straight home, I got off the bus 2 stops early and walked to the Sacramento Public Library. The reference librarian, a patient woman named Carol who reminded me of my former teaching colleagues, helped me navigate the computer system to research stamp values and auction records. What I found made my hands shake so badly I had to set down the mouse and take deep breaths. The 1918 inverted Jenny, a 24-cent airmail stamp printed upside down, had sold at auction for over $4 million. A single stamp. $4 million for a printing error that some collector had preserved in perfect condition for over a century. Walter had mentioned the inverted Jenny many times, usually in the context of it being the holy grail of American stamp collecting, but I had never paid attention to the specific details of what made it so valuable or whether he owned anything remotely similar. I spent 3 hours at that library computer, learning about stamp grading, rarity factors, and auction house procedures. I discovered that the stamp collecting world was far more sophisticated and valuable than I had ever imagined, with rare specimens regularly selling for hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. The research was overwhelming but also intoxicating, like discovering a secret language that Walter had been speaking for decades while I dismissed it as harmless hobby chatter. By the time I caught the evening bus home, my mind was racing with possibilities and questions. I needed to examine Walter's collection properly, not with the casual glance I had given it while packing for the move, but with the focused attention of someone who now understood what might be at stake. The irony of my situation was becoming clearer by the hour. Here I was, accepting government food assistance and being treated like a financial burden, while potentially sitting on a fortune that could change my life completely. But getting access to the collection wouldn't be simple. The albums were stored in Marcus's attic, behind Christmas decorations and old furniture, in an area that Stephanie had declared off-limits to casual browsing. She had specific ideas about organization and cleanliness, and she didn't appreciate anyone rearranging her carefully planned storage system. I would need to find a way to examine the stamps without arousing suspicion, which meant waiting for the right opportunity when both Marcus and Stephanie were occupied elsewhere. That opportunity came the following Saturday, when they took the twins to a soccer tournament that would keep them away from the house for most of the day. I waited until their car disappeared around the corner, then climbed the narrow stairs to the attic with a flashlight and my newfound determination. The space was hot and dusty, filled with the detritus of suburban family life, outgrown clothing, exercise equipment that had been used twice, and boxes labeled in Stephanie's meticulous handwriting. Walter's stamp albums were exactly where I remembered them, stacked in 3 large boxes marked, Walter's hobby stuff, in Stephanie's dismissive scrawl. I opened the first box with trembling fingers, revealing the familiar blue leather albums that had occupied so much of Walter's attention during our 47 years of marriage. The albums were heavier than I remembered, filled with protective sleeves and detailed notation cards in Walter's careful handwriting. The first album contained mostly common stamps, the kind that filled the bulk of any collection, standard issues and commemoratives that might have modest value to collectors, but weren't likely to fund anyone's retirement. But as I worked through the boxes, the quality and rarity of the specimens increased dramatically. Walter had organized his collection by value and significance, starting with the everyday stamps that had introduced him to the hobby and progressing to specimens that even my untrained eye could recognize as special. In the third box, I found what Walter had always called his investment portfolio, a separate album containing stamps that he had acquired specifically for their rarity and potential appreciation. Each stamp was mounted in its own protective sleeve with detailed provenance documentation, including purchase receipts, authentication certificates, and auction house appraisals that made my heart race with their dollar amounts. There it was, in Walter's careful handwriting on a small index card, 1918 24-cent inverted Jenny, position 47 of 100, acquired 1987, current estimated value pending professional appraisal. The stamp itself was mounted in a special protective case, and even to my amateur eye, it was clearly the genuine article, a small blue airplane printed upside down on a cream-colored background, exactly matching the photographs I had studied at the library. But the inverted Jenny wasn't the only treasure in Walter's investment album. There were dozens of other specimens with documentation indicating values in the hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. A 1856 British Guiana 1-cent magenta reproduction that Walter's notes indicated might be authentic. A complete sheet of 1901 Pan American Exposition inverts. A collection of early Chinese stamps that his documentation suggested were worth more than most people's houses. I sat in that dusty attic, surrounded by what appeared to be one of the most valuable private stamp collections in the country, while downstairs my food stamp benefit card sat in my purse like a monument to my supposed poverty. The cognitive dissonance was so extreme I wondered if I was hallucinating, if grief and desperation had finally driven me to fantasy and delusion. But Walter's documentation was meticulous and extensive. He had been having the collection professionally appraised every few years, and the most recent valuation, dated just 6 months before his cancer diagnosis, estimated the total value at over $50 million. $50 million. I was living on food stamps and government assistance while sitting on a fortune that could buy and sell Marcus and Stephanie's entire lifestyle multiple times over. The sound of car doors slamming in the driveway sent me into a panic. I quickly repacked the albums, making sure everything was exactly as I had found it, and climbed down from the attic just as I heard the front door opening. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they would notice, but Marcus and Stephanie were too busy dealing with tired, cranky children to pay attention to my flushed face and dusty clothing. "How was your day, Gladys?" Marcus asked absently, helping one of the twins out of her soccer cleats. "Quiet," I managed to say. "Very quiet." That night, I lay in the guest bedroom staring at the ceiling, trying to process what I had discovered. Walter had been far more than the modest postal worker I had married. He had been a sophisticated collector and investor who had built a world-class stamp collection while living a deliberately understated lifestyle. He had never flaunted his knowledge or boasted about his acquisitions, preferring to let his hobby appear as exactly that, a harmless pastime that kept him busy on weekends. But why hadn't he told me about the true value of what he was building? Had he been protecting me from worry about having so much wealth tied up in tiny pieces of paper? Had he been planning to reveal everything once he retired, as part of some grand surprise about our financial security? Or had he simply enjoyed having one part of his life that was entirely his own, free from discussion or outside influence? The questions kept me awake until dawn, but by morning I had reached a decision. I needed professional confirmation of what I had discovered, which meant finding a reputable stamp dealer or auction house that could provide an independent appraisal. I also needed to understand the legal implications of owning such valuable property while receiving government assistance, and whether there were any reporting requirements or restrictions I needed to be aware of. Most importantly, I needed to decide what to do with the information. The obvious choice was to have the collection appraised and sold, transforming my financial situation overnight and ending my dependence on Marcus and Stephanie's grudging hospitality. But there was something appealing about keeping the secret for a while longer, about watching them continue to treat me like a burden while I sat on enough wealth to buy their entire neighborhood. The next Tuesday, instead of going directly to the grocery store, I took the bus downtown to a stamp shop that had been recommended by the library's reference staff. The shop was exactly what I had expected from Walter's descriptions, a cramped space filled floor to ceiling with albums, catalogs, and protective supplies, presided over by an elderly man who looked like he had been born behind the counter. "I'm interested in having some stamps appraised," I told him, showing him photographs I had secretly taken of a few key pieces from Walter's collection. His reaction was immediate and dramatic. He put down his coffee cup and reached for a magnifying glass, studying the photographs with the intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice tight with excitement. "They belong to my late husband." "Ma'am, if these are authentic, you're looking at specimens worth millions of dollars. The inverted Jenny alone could sell for more than most people make in a lifetime." I left the stamp shop with business cards for 3 auction houses and the phone number of a lawyer who specialized in high-value collectibles. My Tuesday grocery shopping trip had been completely forgotten, replaced by a crash course in the realities of owning museum-quality stamps. The dealer, whose name was Raymond, had insisted on taking detailed photographs of my photos and had practically begged me to bring in the actual stamps for professional authentication. But I wasn't ready for that step yet. First, I wanted to savor the knowledge, to watch Marcus and Stephanie continue their performance of being financially burdened by my presence while I planned my next move. There was something deliciously satisfying about accepting their condescension while knowing I could buy and sell them without impacting my net worth in any meaningful way. The food stamp routine continued, but now every trip to the grocery store felt like theater. I would stand in line with my government benefit card, surrounded by other people facing genuine financial hardships, while mentally calculating that the stamps in Marcus's attic were increasing in value faster than most people's annual salaries. The guilt was starting to eat at me, not guilt about having valuable property, but guilt about accepting benefits I didn't actually need, and guilt about the other people in line who were struggling with real poverty while I was essentially playing dress-up as a poor person. But I wasn't quite ready to end the charade. There was something I needed to do first, something that would make the eventual revelation even more satisfying. I needed to document exactly how Marcus and Stephanie were treating me, to create a record of their behavior that they couldn't later deny or minimize. I started keeping a journal, writing down every condescending comment, every sigh of inconvenience, every reminder of how much I was costing them. The entries painted a picture of emotional abuse disguised as family concern. Stephanie's constant references to my limited resources and fixed income constraints. Marcus's inability to make eye contact when discussing money, as if my financial situation embarrassed him personally. The way they discussed me in front of the twins, as if I were a family pet that required special accommodations rather than their grandmother who deserved basic respect. 3 weeks after my discovery in the attic, the perfect opportunity for confrontation presented itself. Stephanie had organized what she called a financial planning session with Marcus's cousin David, who worked as a financial advisor and had apparently volunteered to help address my situation. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, with David bringing charts and projection software to demonstrate various scenarios for managing my long-term care needs. I agreed to the meeting with enthusiasm that surprised them, offering to provide coffee and refreshments for what I described as an important family discussion. What they didn't know was that I had spent the previous week having Walter's collection professionally appraised by Raymond and 2 other dealers, all of whom had confirmed valuations that exceeded even Walter's most optimistic estimates. The current market value of the collection was just over $52 million, with several pieces appreciating significantly since Walter's last formal appraisal. The inverted Jenny alone was now worth nearly $6 million, making it one of the most valuable stamps in private hands. Raymond had also discovered that Walter's collection included several specimens that had been reported missing from institutional collections, suggesting that my late husband had been operating at the very highest levels of the collector world. Saturday afternoon arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn in Sacramento, the kind of day that made everything feel possible. David arrived precisely on time, carrying a laptop bag and wearing the earnest expression of someone prepared to solve complex problems through the application of spreadsheet logic. Marcus helped him set up at the dining room table while Stephanie arranged refreshments and I sat quietly in my designated chair, hands folded in my lap like a well-behaved child, waiting for adult decisions to be made about her future. Now, Gladys, David began, opening his laptop and launching what appeared to be financial planning software. Marcus and Stephanie have filled me in on your current situation, and I think we can develop some strategies to maximize your independence, while minimizing the financial impact on their household budget. The presentation that followed was a masterpiece of condescension disguised as helpfulness. David had prepared detailed charts showing my monthly income versus expenses, with projected scenarios for assisted living facilities, government benefit optimization, and something called family financial burden mitigation. Every slide reinforced the narrative that I was a problem to be solved, a drain on resources that required careful management to prevent further damage to their financial stability. Stephanie nodded along enthusiastically, occasionally adding comments about the challenges of supporting an elderly family member on a middle-class income. Marcus sat silently, staring at his hands and avoiding eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the entire presentation but unwilling to challenge his wife's agenda. The good news, David concluded, is that with proper planning and resource utilization, we can probably reduce your monthly cost to the family by about 40% while actually improving your quality of life through structured programming and professional support services. The room fell silent as they waited for my response. This was clearly the moment where I was supposed to express gratitude for their efforts and agreement to whatever plan they had developed. Instead, I stood up and walked to the kitchen, returning with a manila folder that I placed on the table in front of David's laptop. Before we finalize any plans, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, I think you should know about some assets that weren't included in your calculations. I opened the folder and spread out the professional appraisals, auction house valuations, and authentication certificates that documented Walter's collection. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of David's breathing as he scanned the documents with increasing amazement. This can't be right, he whispered, holding up the summary page that listed the total collection value. $52 million? Marcus looked up from his hands for the first time all afternoon, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been panic. Stephanie's mouth was hanging open in a way that would have been comical if the situation weren't so emotionally charged. Walter collected stamps, I said simply. I didn't know how valuable they were until recently. Apparently, neither did any of you. The explosion that followed was everything I had hoped for and more. Stephanie's careful composure cracked completely as she began calculating how much money had been sitting in their attic while she lectured me about grocery budgets and government assistance. Marcus kept repeating, "I don't understand," as if repetition would somehow make the numbers make sense. David packed up his laptop without a word, clearly recognizing that his services were no longer needed. "You've been letting us pay for everything while you're worth $50 million? Stephanie's voice had risen to a pitch that probably alarmed the neighbors. "We've been supporting you, giving you food stamps, treating you like." "Like what?" I asked quietly. "Like a burden? Like a charity case? Like someone whose existence was an inconvenience to your lifestyle?" The room fell silent again as the implications of what had been happening became clear to everyone present. For months, they had been treating me with the patronizing kindness reserved for the financially helpless, never suspecting that I could have bought their house with pocket change if I had known what I owned. But the most devastating part wasn't the money, it was the revelation of who they really were when they thought I had no other options. The food stamps, the lectures about budgeting, the condescending family meetings about my situation, all of it had been unnecessary theater. Performed by people who saw my dependence as an opportunity to feel superior rather than a chance to show love. Marcus finally found his voice. "Mom, we didn't know. If we had known about the stamps, everything would have been different." I looked at my son, this man I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, and realized that his response was exactly the problem. Everything would have been different because the money would have changed their behavior, not because they recognized that their behavior had been wrong regardless of my financial status. "Would it have been different, Marcus?" I asked. "Or would you have just treated me better because you thought I might be useful to you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire they couldn't put out. Because we all knew the answer. And the answer was ugly in a way that couldn't be fixed with apologies or explanations. David excused himself quietly, leaving the three of us to navigate the wreckage of relationships that had been built on false assumptions and revealed to be far more fragile than any of us had wanted to admit. The dining room table was still covered with the evidence of their financial planning session, charts and projections that had become instantly obsolete the moment they learned the truth about Walter's stamps. I gathered up the appraisal documents and returned them to the manila folder, taking my time and letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. When I finally looked up, both Marcus and Stephanie were staring at me with expressions I had never seen before, a mixture of embarrassment, calculation, and something that might have been fear. "So what happens now?" Stephanie asked, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. I stood up and smoothed my skirt, feeling more like myself than I had in months. "Now I figure out what I want to do with the rest of my life," I said. "And you figure out how to live with the people you've shown yourselves to be." As I walked toward the guest bedroom that had been my entire world for the past year, I could hear them whispering frantically behind me, probably calculating how much money they had lost by treating me so badly, and wondering if there was any way to undo the damage they had done to our relationship. But that was their problem to solve now. I had a fortune to figure out, a life to rebuild, and a future to plan that didn't include anyone who had seen my vulnerability as weakness rather than an opportunity to show love. The food stamp card was still in my purse, a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change and how important it was to pay attention to who stood beside you when you thought you had nothing left to lose. Tomorrow I would call Raymond and begin the process of liquidating Walter's collection, transforming 50 years of careful collecting into the financial freedom that would let me choose my own ending to this story. Tonight, though, I would sit in this guest bedroom one last time and plan exactly how I wanted to leave, and who I wanted to become when I walked out the door. The morning after the family meeting, I woke before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. While Marcus and Stephanie slept soundly in their master bedroom, probably dreaming about damage control and missed opportunities, I was already dressed and sitting at the small desk in my room, making lists. Not grocery lists or budget calculations, but plans for a life I was finally free to design. The first call I made was to Raymond at the stamp shop, who answered on the second ring despite the early hour. Serious collectors, I was learning, kept unusual schedules when valuable pieces were at stake. "Mrs. Henderson," his voice carried the excitement of someone who had spent the night researching provenance records and auction histories. "I've been making calls about your husband's collection. The auction houses are very interested, but I need to warn you about something important." I settled deeper into the desk chair, pen poised over my notebook. "I'm listening. Your husband wasn't just a collector, he was a legend in this field. People have been wondering for decades where some of these pieces ended up after they disappeared from public view. Walter Henderson was operating at the absolute pinnacle of the hobby, acquiring specimens that most collectors only dream about seeing in museums. The pride I felt hearing Walter described this way was mixed with a sharp sadness that he had never shared this side of himself with me. How many evenings had I interrupted his work, bringing him dinner and chatting about neighborhood gossip, while he was quietly examining pieces worth more than most people's annual salaries. "There's more," Raymond continued. The 1856 British Guiana that's in his collection? We think it might be the genuine article, not a reproduction like his notes suggest. If authentication confirms what we suspect, you're not looking at $50 million. You're looking at closer to $75 million. I set down my pen and stared out the window at Stephanie's perfectly manicured garden, where she grew herbs she never used and flowers she replaced seasonally to maintain optimal curb appeal. $75 million. The number was so large it felt fictional, like something from a movie about lottery winners or tech entrepreneurs, not retired postal workers from Sacramento. What's the next step? I asked. I need to bring in specialists from New York, people who handle collections at this level. We're talking about auction house partnerships, insurance requirements, security protocols. This isn't something we can handle through normal channels. After ending the call with Raymond, I sat in the pre-dawn quiet of the guest room and tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. Walter had built something extraordinary while living a deliberately modest life, never letting on that our financial security extended far beyond what our middle-class lifestyle suggested. The question that kept circling through my mind was why he had kept this secret, and what he had planned to do with such wealth. I opened the bottom drawer of the small dresser and pulled out the wooden box where I kept Walter's personal papers, things I had packed automatically but never examined closely after his death. His reading glasses were still folded on top, next to the leather appointment book he had used to track doctor visits and treatment schedules during his final months. Underneath, I found what I was looking for, his personal journal, a simple composition notebook where he had recorded thoughts and observations that were too private for casual conversation. The entries near the end were heartbreaking in their practicality. Lists of medications and side effects, notes about insurance claims and medical appointments, reminders to himself about financial arrangements that needed to be finalized before his condition deteriorated further. But scattered throughout were references to the collection project and long-term security planning that I now understood in an entirely new context. Gladys worries too much about money, he had written 6 months before his death. She doesn't understand that we've been secure for years, that the stamps represent more wealth than we could spend in several lifetimes. I've been waiting for the right moment to explain everything, but the timing never feels appropriate. How do you tell someone you've been quietly building a fortune while she clips coupons and shops sales? Further back in the journal, I found entries that revealed the scope of Walter's collecting activities. He had been corresponding with dealers in London, attending private auctions in New York, and consulting with authentication experts who specialized in the rarest specimens. What I had seen as weekend hobby trips were actually business ventures, carefully planned acquisitions that had been building towards something much larger than personal satisfaction. Acquired the Mauritius today, read an entry from 3 years ago. Cost more than our first house, but the appreciation potential is extraordinary. Gladys thinks I'm at a stamp show in Portland, which is technically true, but she has no idea. I just purchased what might be the finest example in private hands. The Mauritius. Even I knew enough about stamps now to recognize that name. The 1847 Mauritius stamps were among the most valuable in the world, with specimens selling for millions of dollars when they appeared at auction. Walter had owned examples that were apparently superior to anything currently available to collectors. As I read through his journal entries, a picture emerged of a man who had been carefully constructing financial security while maintaining the fiction of modest retirement planning. He had been protecting me from worry about large sums of money tied up in illiquid assets, but he had also been protecting himself from having to explain investment decisions that might have seemed reckless or irresponsible to someone who didn't understand the collecting market. The beauty of stamps, he had written, is that people assume they're worthless unless they know better. I can own pieces worth more than luxury cars without anyone asking questions about insurance or security. Gladys sees the albums and thinks Walter's hobby, not generational wealth building. The journal also revealed that Walter had been working on what he called succession planning, trying to decide how and when to reveal the collection's value to me. He had been consulting with estate planning attorneys and insurance specialists, apparently preparing detailed documentation that would help me understand and manage the collection after his death. I need to tell her soon, read an entry from just months before his cancer diagnosis. She deserves to know that her financial future is secure, that she'll never need to depend on Marcus or anyone else for support. But I also know that knowledge will change how she sees our life together, will make her question why I kept this secret for so long. The irony was devastating. Walter had been trying to protect me from financial worry while building a fortune that would have eliminated any concern about money forever. His death had interrupted those plans, leaving me to discover the truth only after months of accepting charity from people who had no idea what was gathering dust in their attic. I closed the journal and walked to the kitchen, where the coffee maker was already brewing the generic brand that Stephanie had determined was the most cost-effective option for our household budget. The normalcy of the morning routine felt surreal. Against the backdrop of what I now knew about my actual financial situation. Marcus appeared in the kitchen 20 minutes later, still wearing pajamas and looking like he hadn't slept well. He moved around the space carefully, avoiding eye contact. And clearly struggling with how to navigate our new dynamic. The easy condescension of yesterday had been replaced by an awkwardness that would have been amusing if it weren't so pathetic. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice artificially cheerful. "How did you sleep?" "Very well, thank you." I poured coffee into the mug I had been using for months, the one with the chip on the handle that Stephanie considered too damaged for company but adequate for everyday use. He opened the refrigerator and stared into it for longer than necessary, clearly buying time while he figured out what to say. "About yesterday, about the meeting with David. I think we all learned some things that, changed the situation." "What situation is that, Marcus?" My question forced him to look at me directly for the first time since the revelations about Walter's collection. "The financial situation. Your living arrangements. The whole dynamic we've been operating under." I sat down at the kitchen table and gestured for him to join me. "What dynamic is that?" The discomfort on his face was obvious as he struggled to find words that wouldn't sound as terrible as the truth. "How do you explain that you've been treating your elderly mother like a charity case without admitting that you saw her vulnerability? As an opportunity to feel superior? We thought you were struggling financially," he said finally. "We were trying to help. By making me use food stamps while discussing assisted living facilities behind my back." His face flushed red. "We never seriously discussed assisted living. Stephanie might have mentioned it as a possibility, but we weren't making any decisions without talking to you first." I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app that I had discovered weeks earlier, during one of my Tuesday library visits when a helpful teenager had shown me features I didn't know existed. Marcus didn't notice as I pressed record and set the phone on the table between us. "Marcus, I need you to be honest with me about something. If you had never learned about Walter's stamp collection, what was the plan for my living situation? Not what you told David yesterday, but what you and Stephanie discussed privately when you thought I couldn't contribute more financially." The silence that followed was answer enough, but I waited for him to fill it with words that would confirm what I already knew. When people feel guilty, they tend to confess more than they intended if you give them enough quiet space to feel uncomfortable. "Stephanie has been looking into some very nice facilities," he said finally. "Places that specialize in helping elderly people maintain independence while providing support services. She wasn't planning anything, just researching options in case your needs changed." "And how are you planning to pay for these facilities on my Social Security income?" Another silence, longer this time. "We thought we might need to help supplement the costs. Temporarily, until you qualified for additional assistance programs." "What kind of assistance programs?" "Medicaid, maybe some state programs for seniors." Stephanie had done a lot of research into what might be available. I stopped the recording and slipped the phone back into my pocket. In less than 5 minutes, Marcus had confirmed that they had been actively planning to move me into institutional care funded by government assistance, all while positioning themselves as generous family members making sacrifices to help an elderly relative. The front door opened and Stephanie entered the kitchen carrying grocery bags and wearing the bright smile she used when she wanted to signal that everything was perfectly normal despite obvious evidence to the contrary. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice carrying forced cheer. "I picked up a few things for breakfast. Gladys, I got that cereal you like, the name brand one." The gesture was so transparently calculated that I almost laughed. After months of lecturing me about the cost difference between generic and name brand cereals, she was now making a show of purchasing the more expensive option as if it demonstrated newfound generosity rather than damage control. "That's very thoughtful, Stephanie. How much did it cost?" Her smile faltered slightly. "Oh, I don't remember exactly. It wasn't too much. I ask because I'd like to reimburse you. I wouldn't want you to think I was taking advantage of your generosity." The phrase, taking advantage, hung in the air like an accusation, which it was. For months, they had framed every expense related to my presence as me taking advantage of their good nature, never acknowledging that families are supposed to care for each other without keeping detailed financial scorecards. Marcus stood up abruptly, clearly desperate to escape the tension that was building in the kitchen. "I should get ready for work. We can talk more about everything later, when we've all had time to process." After he left, Stephanie began unpacking groceries with excessive focus, organizing items in the refrigerator and pantry with the kind of meticulous attention that suggested she was trying to avoid conversation. I remained at the kitchen table, drinking my coffee and watching her performance of domestic normalcy. Stephanie, we need to discuss some practical matters. She looked up from arranging yogurt containers by expiration date. Of course. What kind of practical matters? I'll be moving out soon. I need to know how much notice you require for the guest room. The yogurt container in her hand nearly slipped to the floor. Moving out? Where? I mean, you don't need to rush into any decisions. Yesterday was a lot of information to process. And I think we all need time to adjust to the new circumstances. What new circumstances? It was fascinating to watch her struggle with how to reference the money without sounding like she was primarily interested in my newfound wealth. Well, your improved financial situation changes some things. We could restructure our arrangement here, maybe make some modifications that would work better for everyone. What kind of modifications? We could convert the guest room into more of a proper suite. Add a small refrigerator, maybe a microwave. Give you more independence while you're staying here. The offer was pathetic in its transparency. Yesterday, the guest room had been adequate for a charity case who should be grateful for basic shelter. Today, with $50 million in the picture, suddenly it needed upgrading to proper suite status. That's a generous offer, but I think it's time for me to establish my own household again. Stephanie set down the yogurt and turned to face me fully. Gladys, I know yesterday was awkward, with David's presentation and all. But we really were just trying to help. We had no idea about Walter's collection, about your actual financial situation. If we had known, everything would have been different. There it was again, the same response Marcus had given. Everything would have been different if they had known about the money, as if the money was what should have determined how they treated me, rather than the simple fact that I was family who needed support. How would it have been different? Stephanie? She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, apparently recognizing the trap in the question. Any answer she gave would reveal that their treatment of me had been based on perceived financial status rather than genuine care or respect. We would have been more collaborative, she said finally. More partnership-oriented in our approach to household decisions. Partnership-oriented. I repeated the phrase slowly, letting her hear how it sounded. Is that what you call making someone use government assistance while lecturing them about fiscal responsibility? Her face flushed red. The food stamps were your idea. You applied for them. After you spent weeks explaining why my grocery consumption was unsustainable for your household budget. We were trying to be practical about limited resources. Your resources weren't limited, Stephanie. Your willingness to share them was. The conversation was interrupted by the twins arriving in the kitchen, still in their pajamas and looking for breakfast. Their presence immediately changed the dynamic, forcing both Stephanie and me to adopt the artificial pleasantness that adults use when discussing serious matters in front of children. Good morning, Grandma Gladys, said Emma, the younger twin. Are you coming to my piano recital next week? I looked at Stephanie, who was suddenly very interested in organizing the cereal boxes. I don't think I'll still be living here next week, sweetheart. Where are you going? Asked Sophie, the older twin. I'm going to find my own place to live. Somewhere I can have my own kitchen and garden. The girls accepted this information. With the adaptability of children who assume adult decisions are reasonable even when they don't understand them. Stephanie, however, looked panicked at the prospect of explaining my departure to neighbors and friends who might ask questions about why the elderly grandmother had suddenly moved out. After breakfast, I called Raymond and arranged to meet him at a neutral location to discuss the next steps for authentication and potential sale of Walter's collection. I also called James Puett, the estate planning attorney whose name I had found in Walter's papers, and scheduled an appointment to discuss the legal and tax implications of liquidating such valuable assets. The stamp shop meeting was held at a small conference room in a downtown hotel, with Raymond bringing 2 specialists from New York who had flown in specifically to examine photographs and documentation of Walter's pieces. The level of professional attention was unlike anything I had ever experienced, with each expert treating Walter's collection as a significant cultural and financial event rather than a simple estate sale. Mrs. Henderson, said Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a curator from the Smithsonian who had been consulted about several pieces in the collection. Your husband assembled what is quite possibly the finest private collection of postal history in North America. Some of these pieces haven't been seen publicly in decades. The other specialist, a dealer named Harrison Mills who represented several major auction houses, spread out enlarged photographs of key stamps and began explaining their significance. With the enthusiasm of someone discussing lost masterpieces. The inverted Jenny is remarkable, obviously, but it's this group of early Chinese pieces that's really extraordinary, he said, pointing to images of stamps I recognized from Walter's most protected album. These are imperial Chinese specimens. that were thought to have been destroyed during political upheavals. Your husband somehow acquired examples that collectors assumed no longer existed. As the meeting progressed, I began to understand that Walter had been operating at a level of the collecting world that few people ever reach. He hadn't just been buying expensive stamps, he had been preserving postal history, acquiring pieces that would have been lost forever without collectors willing to pay enormous sums to ensure their survival. The question, said Dr. Chen, is whether you want to sell the collection as individual pieces, which would maximize financial return, or keep it together and potentially donate portions to museums for substantial tax benefits while retaining the most valuable pieces. Harrison nodded in agreement. There are also private collectors who might be interested in acquiring the entire collection intact. Keeping it together would be remarkable for scholarship and research, but it would also mean accepting slightly lower financial returns in exchange for ensuring the collection's historical integrity. I listened to their discussions of options and strategies, but my attention kept drifting to the larger question of what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. Financial security was wonderful, but it was also just the beginning of figuring out who I wanted to become now that I was free from other people's limitations and expectations. I need some time to consider the options, I said. How long do we have before decisions need to be made? Authentication and insurance will take several weeks, Raymond explained. That gives you time to think about your preferences for sale versus donation, individual pieces versus collection integrity. But I'd recommend moving the collection to secure storage as soon as possible. Keeping pieces worth this much money in a residential attic isn't advisable. The drive back to Marcus and Stephanie's house gave me time to process the magnitude of the decisions I was facing. Walter had left me not just financial security, but also responsibility for preserving something culturally significant. His collection represented decades of careful curation, and how I chose to handle it would determine whether his work continued to contribute to postal history or simply disappeared into private hands. More immediately, I needed to figure out where I wanted to live and how I wanted to structure my new independence. The guest room that had felt like a prison was about to become irrelevant, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to replace it with. Did I want to buy a house in Sacramento to stay near the twins, despite the awkwardness with Marcus and Stephanie? Did I want to move somewhere entirely new, perhaps closer to Walter's family back east? Or did I want to use this opportunity to explore parts of the country I had never seen, traveling and experiencing things that had been financially impossible during our working years? When I arrived home, Marcus's car was already in the driveway, unusual for a weekday afternoon. I found him and Stephanie sitting at the kitchen table with serious expressions and what appeared to be financial documents spread between them. "Mom, we need to talk," Marcus said as I entered the kitchen. I sat down across from them and waited for whatever conversation they had been planning while I was out. "We've been discussing your situation," Stephanie began, "and we want you to know that you're welcome to stay here as long as you want. We were thinking we could work out a more formal arrangement, maybe charge you market rate rent for the guest room and give you more independence within the household." The offer was so tone-deaf that I wondered if they had spent the afternoon deliberately trying to think of the most insulting proposal possible. Market rate rent for a guest room in their house, after months of treating me like a charity case. Now that they knew I was worth tens of millions of dollars. Market rate rent, I repeated slowly. For a guest room. Well, we'd need to make some improvements first, Marcus added quickly. The private entrance we talked about, maybe expanding. The bathroom. We could make it into a really nice in-law suite. I looked at the financial documents they had spread on the table and realized they were real estate listings for comparable properties, rental market analyses, and what appeared to be renovation cost estimates. They had spent the day calculating how much money they could extract from my presence now that I was wealthy enough to pay premium prices for the privilege of remaining in their spare room. "That's very entrepreneurial of you both," I said. "But I won't be needing those services." Stephanie's face fell. "We're not trying to take advantage of your new situation. We're trying to find a way to make this arrangement work better for everyone. By charging me rent to live in the same room where you've been making me feel like a burden for months." "We never made you feel like a burden," Marcus protested. "We were just trying to be responsible about household budgets." I pulled out my phone and played back part of the recording I had made that morning, where Marcus had described their research into assisted living facilities and government assistance programs. His voice filled the kitchen, discussing their plans for my future with the casual tone of someone arranging pet boarding. "That conversation happened this morning," I said when the recording ended. "Before you knew I wouldn't need government assistance to pay for institutional care." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the refrigerator cycling on. Marcus stared at the phone as if it might disappear if he looked at it long enough. Stephanie's face had gone completely white. "You recorded our conversation without telling me," Marcus said finally. I documented our conversation so I could review it later for accuracy. Is there something on that recording that you'd like to dispute? Neither of them answered, probably because the recording made it impossible to deny that they had been planning to institutionalize me while positioning themselves as reluctant heroes making sacrifices for family obligation. I stood up and gathered my purse and keys. I'll be moving out by the end of the week. I'll let you know where to send any mail that arrives for me. As I walked toward the guest room to begin packing, I could hear them whispering frantically behind me, probably trying to calculate how much potential income they had just lost and whether there was any way to salvage their relationship with someone who could now afford to never forgive them. The next morning, I called a moving company and arranged for my belongings to be packed and placed in temporary storage while I figured out my longer-term housing plans. I also called a real estate agent and began looking at houses in neighborhoods I had never considered before, places where privacy and security were more important than proximity to good schools or shopping centers. The twins were the hardest part of leaving. They had become accustomed to having me around for help with homework and bedtime stories, and they didn't understand why I was suddenly moving away. Explaining the situation without damaging their relationship with their parents required more diplomatic skill than I possessed, so I settled for telling them that I needed my own space but would visit them often. "Will you still come to my piano recital?" Emma asked, clinging to my hand as the movers loaded my furniture into their truck. "I'll be there," I promised, though I suspected that attending family events was going to be complicated for the foreseeable future. Marcus and Stephanie watched the moving process from the kitchen window, occasionally coming outside to ask questions about forwarding addresses and contact information. Their concern felt performative, focused more on maintaining appearances for the neighbors than genuine care about my welfare. As the moving truck pulled away from the house that had been my residence for almost a year, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Walter's death: excitement about the future. For months, I had been living other people's version of my life, accepting their definitions of my limitations and possibilities. Now I was free to discover what my own version looked like, with resources that made almost anything possible. The hotel suite I checked into that afternoon was larger than the guest room I had been living in, with a sitting area, kitchenette, and windows that overlooked a park where elderly people walked dogs and fed ducks without anyone monitoring their grocery expenses or questioning their life choices. I ordered room service dinner, something I hadn't done since Walter's illness, and spread out brochures for houses, travel destinations, and charitable organizations that worked with seniors. The world had suddenly become much larger, and I had the rest of my life to explore it on my own terms. That evening, as I sat in a comfortable chair looking out at the lights of Sacramento, I called Raymond to confirm that we should proceed with moving Walter's collection to secure storage and beginning the authentication process. Whatever I decided to do with the stamps, they deserved to be treated with the respect and care that Walter had shown them during his decades of collecting. I also called James Pute and scheduled an appointment to discuss estate planning, charitable giving strategies, and the legal structures that would protect my newfound wealth while allowing me to use it for purposes that would have made Walter proud. The guest room phase of my life was over, and the next chapter was about to begin. For the first time in years, I was the author of my own story, with resources that made it possible to write any ending I chose. The house I chose was nothing like the modest suburban homes Walter and I had shared during our 47 years of marriage. Perched on 3 acres in the hills above Sacramento, the modern glass and steel structure felt like something from an architecture magazine, all clean lines and panoramic views that stretched to the mountains on clear days. The price tag of $2.8 million would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier, but now it represented less than 5% of my liquid assets, a mathematical reality that still felt surreal every time I thought about it. The real estate agent, a polished woman named Victoria who specialized in luxury properties, had initially seemed puzzled by my interest in such an expensive home. I could see her mental calculations as she tried to reconcile my appearance and age with the financial requirements of her listing. Her attitude shifted dramatically when I made an all-cash offer $20,000 above asking price and requested a 30-day closing, backed by bank statements that made her eyes widen with professional appreciation. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, reviewing the financial documentation that James Pute had prepared, "I have to say, this is one of the most straightforward transactions I've ever handled. Most buyers at this price point require complex financing arrangements and extended negotiations. Your ability to close quickly with cash will be very appealing to the sellers." What Victoria didn't understand was that I wasn't just buying a house, I was purchasing freedom from ever again having to live according to someone else's definition of what I could afford or deserve. Every room in the new house was larger than the guest bedroom that had contained my entire existence for nearly a year, and every window offered views that belonged to me rather than being grudgingly shared by people who saw my presence as an imposition. The moving process revealed how little I actually owned after decades of marriage and years of downsizing due to financial constraints. My furniture, clothes, and personal items filled less than half of the moving truck, leaving vast empty spaces in the new house that would need to be thoughtfully filled. For the first time in my adult life, I could choose furniture based on comfort and aesthetics rather than price and practicality, a freedom that felt almost overwhelming in its scope. I hired an interior designer named Patricia Summers, a woman in her 50s who had built a reputation creating elegant spaces for executives and entrepreneurs who wanted sophistication without ostentation. Patricia understood immediately that I needed help translating newfound wealth into a home that felt authentic rather than trying to impress anyone with expensive displays. The goal, Patricia explained during our first consultation, is to create spaces that reflect your personality and lifestyle while taking advantage of the beautiful architecture and views. We're not trying to prove anything to anyone, we're just making you comfortable in your own space. The furniture selection process became a kind of therapy, forcing me to think about who I was becoming rather than who I had been. Did I want formal dining room furniture that could accommodate large family gatherings, or a more casual approach that prioritized intimate conversations? Did I need multiple guest bedrooms for visitors, or would I prefer to use those spaces for hobbies and interests I had never had room to pursue? While Patricia worked on transforming the house into a home, I focused on the more complex task of deciding what to do with Walter's stamp collection. The authentication process was proceeding smoothly, with experts confirming that every major piece was genuine and several specimens proving to be even rarer than Walter's documentation had suggested. The total value had stabilized at just over $76 million, making it one of the most valuable private philatelic collections ever assembled. Harrison Mills from the auction house had presented 3 distinct options for handling the collection, each with different financial and cultural implications. The first option involved selling everything through major auction houses over a period of 2 years, maximizing financial return but scattering the collection to individual buyers around the world. The second option focused on donating significant portions to museums while retaining the most valuable pieces, providing substantial tax benefits while preserving Walter's curatorial vision. The third option involved finding a single buyer who would acquire the entire collection intact, probably an institution or extremely wealthy individual who valued historical preservation over investment potential. I spent hours reviewing the options with James Pewitt, who helped me understand the tax implications and legal structures that would be necessary for each approach. The financial differences were significant. Selling everything individually could net over $60 million after taxes and fees, while donation strategies might provide only $30 million in actual income but would result in enormous tax benefits and charitable impact. The question, James said during one of our planning sessions, is what you want your legacy to be. Walter spent 50 years building something culturally significant. How you handle it will determine whether his work continues to contribute to scholarship and public education, or simply disappears into private hands. The weight of that responsibility was heavier than the financial decisions. Walter had been building more than personal wealth, he had been preserving postal history, acquiring pieces that might have been lost forever without collectors willing to pay extraordinary sums for their protection. My choices would determine whether his life's work continued to serve a larger purpose or simply funded my comfortable retirement. During this period of major decisions, I maintained minimal contact with Marcus and Stephanie, responding to their occasional calls and messages with polite but distant updates about my new living situation. They had made several attempts to visit or invite themselves for dinner at the new house, offers that I declined with the same cool politeness they had shown when I lived in their guest room and needed rides to medical appointments. The twins were different, though. Emma and Sophie called regularly, wanting to know about my new house and when they could visit. Their genuine affection was uncomplicated by the financial considerations that had poisoned my relationship with their parents, and I found myself looking forward to their calls in ways that reminded me why family relationships were supposed to feel supportive rather than transactional. Grandma Gladys, do you have a swimming pool? Sophie asked during one of our phone conversations. I don't yet, but I'm thinking about having one built. Would you like to help me choose the design? Can we have a sleepover in your new house? Mom said we have to wait until you're settled, but I think you sound settled already. The question forced me to confront the delicate balance I needed to maintain between rebuilding my relationship with the twins and managing the ongoing tension with Marcus and Stephanie. I wanted to be part of my granddaughters' lives, but I also wasn't ready to pretend that nothing had changed between their parents and me. We'll definitely have sleepovers, I promised Sophie. But let's wait until I have everything set up properly. I want to make sure I have the right furniture and activities for when you visit. 3 weeks after moving into the new house, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Elizabeth Chen at the Smithsonian. She had completed her initial assessment of Walter's collection and wanted to discuss a proposal that went beyond anything the auction house representatives had suggested. "Mrs. Henderson, what your husband assembled is more than just valuable stamps," she explained. "It's a comprehensive archive of postal history that could serve as the foundation for a major exhibition and research program. We'd like to discuss the possibility of establishing a permanent Walter Henderson collection at the National Postal Museum." The proposal was complex and ambitious. The Smithsonian would acquire the collection through a combination of purchase and donation, creating a dedicated exhibition space and research facility that would bear Walter's name. The financial arrangements would provide me with substantial income while ensuring that the collection remained accessible to scholars and the public forever. The Walter Henderson collection would become one of the premier philatelic research facilities in the world, Dr. Chen continued. "Your husband's documentation and provenance research were so thorough that we could offer educational programs, traveling exhibitions, and digital archives that would reach millions of people." As she described the proposal, I realized that this option offered something the others couldn't, a way to honor Walter's memory while creating something that would outlast both of us. Instead of dispersing his life's work to private collectors, or simply converting it to cash for my personal use, the collection could become a permanent tribute to his expertise and passion. The financial terms were generous but secondary to the cultural impact. The museum would pay $45 million for the collection while providing a tax deduction worth an additional $15 million, leaving me with enough wealth to live comfortably while creating something that would preserve Walter's legacy for future generations. I scheduled a meeting with James Pute to review the Smithsonian proposal in detail, but I already knew it was the right choice. Walter had spent 5 decades building something extraordinary. I could spend the rest of my life ensuring it served a purpose worthy of his dedication. While these major decisions were taking shape, I was also discovering the simpler pleasures of financial independence. Shopping for groceries became an experience rather than a careful calculation, allowing me to choose foods based on preference and quality rather than price and practicality. I could afford organic produce, premium cuts of meat, and imported cheeses that had been luxuries during my married years, but more importantly, I could shop without anxiety about budget constraints or disapproval from people who monitored my consumption patterns. The difference extended beyond material purchases to choices about time and activities. I enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the community college, something I had always wanted to try but never felt justified in spending money on during Walter's illness and our financial struggles. I hired a personal trainer to help rebuild strength and mobility that had declined during the months of stress and depression following Walter's death. I bought season tickets to the Sacramento Philharmonic and subscribed to a wine club that delivered bottles worth more than I used to spend on groceries in a week. Each of these choices felt like reclaiming parts of myself that had been suppressed by years of financial worry and months of living according to other people's expectations. I wasn't becoming frivolous or wasteful, but I was rediscovering interests and capabilities that had been dormant while I focused on survival and accommodation. The painting class was particularly revelatory. I had never considered myself artistic, but working with watercolors required a kind of patience and attention to detail that reminded me of Walter's approach to his stamp collection. The instructor, a retired art teacher named Margaret who was close to my own age, encouraged experimentation and creativity without judgment, creating an environment where mistakes were learning opportunities rather than failures. "You have good instincts for color and composition," Margaret told me after reviewing my 3rd attempt at landscape painting. "Have you done any art before?" "Not really. I've always been more practical than creative." "Well, you're creative now. Sometimes it just takes the right circumstances to discover what we're capable of." The comment stayed with me as I worked on subsequent paintings, each one slightly more confident than the last. Margaret was right. I was discovering capabilities I hadn't known I possessed, not just in art but in every aspect of my newly independent life. Financial security had eliminated the constant background anxiety that had shaped my decisions for years, allowing mental and emotional space for growth and exploration that hadn't been possible when survival was the primary concern. The personal training sessions were equally transformative, though in different ways. My trainer, a young woman named Ashley who specialized in working with older adults, designed programs that gradually rebuilt strength and flexibility while respecting the limitations imposed by age and previous injuries. The work was challenging but achievable, with measurable progress that felt empowering after months of feeling physically and emotionally diminished. "Mrs. Henderson, your balance and coordination have improved dramatically, Ashley observed during one of our sessions. How are you feeling about the changes? Stronger, I said, testing my stability on one foot in a way that would have been impossible months earlier. Not just physically, but overall. Ashley nodded knowingly. Physical strength and emotional confidence are connected in ways that people don't always realize. When you feel capable in your body, it affects how you approach everything else. She was right. The combination of financial security, comfortable living space, and improved physical condition was creating a foundation for confidence that extended far beyond any single area of my life. I was becoming someone who made decisions based on preference rather than limitation, who engaged with the world from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. The contrast with my previous living situation became even starker when Marcus called to invite me to Emma's piano recital, an event I had been anticipating since before moving out of their house. The conversation was awkward from the beginning, with Marcus clearly struggling to find the right tone for our changed relationship. The recital is next Tuesday at 7, he said. We wanted to make sure you could still come. Of course I'll be there. I told Emma I wouldn't miss it. Great. Would you like to come for dinner beforehand? Stephanie thought it might be nice to have a family meal before the performance. The invitation felt calculated, an attempt to normalize our relationship and possibly demonstrate to the twins that everything was fine between the adults in their lives. I considered declining, but Emma's excitement about the recital made me reluctant to introduce additional complications into what should be a celebration of her accomplishment. I'll come for the recital, I said. But I think I'll skip dinner. I'd prefer to meet you at the venue. Marcus's disappointment was obvious in his voice. Okay. I understand. We'll save you a seat with the family. The piano recital was held in the community center auditorium, a modest space that was nevertheless packed with families supporting young musicians. I arrived early and found the seats Marcus had reserved, nodding politely to Stephanie and settling in to wait for the performance. To begin, Emma's piece was a simplified version of a Mozart sonata, performed with the careful concentration of a 9-year-old who had practiced diligently but was still working to master the technical demands of the music. She played beautifully, her small hands moving confidently across the keys while her face showed the intense focus that reminded me of Walter working on his stamp albums. During the intermission, several other families approached to congratulate Emma and chat with Marcus and Stephanie. I noticed how they introduced me. This is Marcus's mother, Gladys, without any of the context or background that might have explained my absence from previous family events. The conversations were pleasant but surface level, focused on the performance and general family updates rather than anything substantive. What struck me most was how different I felt compared to the last time I had attended a family event. Instead of worrying about transportation home or whether my presence was imposing on their schedules, I was simply enjoying Emma's performance and planning what kind of celebration gift I might give her. The change in my circumstances had eliminated layers of anxiety and dependence that I hadn't fully recognized until they were gone. After the recital, Emma ran over to hug me and ask what I thought of her performance. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself swept up in her excitement, without the emotional complications that characterized my interactions with her parents. You were wonderful, I told her. Mozart would be proud. Grandma Gladys, when can we see your new house? Mom said you have a really big kitchen. Before I could answer, Stephanie appeared beside us with the forced smile that had become her default expression around me. Emma, let's not bother Grandma with house visits right now. She's still getting settled. It's not a bother, I said, looking directly at Emma. I'd love to show you the house. Maybe we can plan a weekend visit once I finish decorating. The exchange was brief but telling. Stephanie was clearly uncomfortable with the idea of the twins seeing my new living situation, probably because it would raise questions about why I had been living in their guest room when I could obviously afford much better accommodations. The contrast between my previous circumstances and current lifestyle would be difficult to explain without acknowledging that their support had been less generous than they had portrayed it. As families began leaving the auditorium, Marcus approached with the hesitant manner that had characterized all our interactions since the revelation about Walter's collection. Mom, could we talk for a minute? Privately? I followed him to a quiet corner of the lobby while Stephanie helped the twins pack up their programs and flowers from well-wishers. I've been thinking about our conversation the other day, he began. About the recording, and the things Stephanie and I discussed regarding your living situation. What about them? I want you to know that we never intended for you to feel unwelcome or burdensome. We were trying to be practical about a difficult situation, but I can see how our approach might have seemed. He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound as harsh as the reality. Might have seemed what, Marcus? Conditional. Like our support was based on your financial contribution rather than family obligation. I waited for him to continue, curious about where this confession was leading. The truth is, we were struggling with the added expenses of supporting another person, but we should have been more honest about that instead of making you feel like the problem was your consumption rather than our budget limitations. It was the closest thing to an apology I had received, though it still framed the issue as a communication problem rather than a fundamental failure of empathy and respect. Marcus was acknowledging that their approach had been wrong without taking responsibility for the underlying attitude that had made such an approach possible. I appreciate you saying that, I said carefully. But the issue wasn't your budget constraints, Marcus. It was your willingness to treat me as a burden while presenting yourselves as generous benefactors. He looked uncomfortable but didn't argue with my characterization. Is there anything we can do to repair the relationship? I know the twins miss having you around. The question forced me to confront what I actually wanted from my relationship with Marcus and his family going forward. I loved the twins and wanted to maintain connections with them, but I also wasn't interested in pretending that nothing had changed between their parents and me. Trust, once broken by the kind of systematic disrespect I had experienced, wasn't easily rebuilt through apologies and good intentions. I think we need time, I said finally. What happened wasn't just a misunderstanding or communication problem. It revealed something about how you and Stephanie view family obligations and what you consider acceptable treatment of people who depend on your support. Marcus nodded slowly, apparently recognizing that quick fixes weren't going to be sufficient for addressing the damage that had been done. We'd like to try to rebuild things gradually, he said. Maybe start with family occasions like tonight, and see if we can work towards something better. It wasn't an unreasonable request, but it also wasn't a commitment I was ready to make. The power dynamic between us had shifted so fundamentally that I wasn't sure what a healthy relationship would look like going forward. I had the financial resources to be completely independent, but I also had emotional connections to the twins that I didn't want to sacrifice because of conflicts with their parents. We can take it slowly, I agreed. But I won't pretend that everything is fine when it isn't. If we're going to rebuild our relationship, it has to be based on honesty rather than convenience. As I drove home to my new house in the hills, I reflected on how different the evening had felt compared to similar family events during my months in their guest room. Instead of worrying about transportation or imposing on their schedules, I had been able to focus entirely on Emma's performance and my pride in her accomplishment. The change in my circumstances had eliminated the layers of anxiety and dependence that had complicated every family interaction during my most vulnerable period. The house felt welcoming when I arrived, with lights on timers and fresh flowers from my weekly delivery service creating an atmosphere of comfort and stability. I poured a glass of wine from my collection and sat in the living room looking out at the lights of Sacramento spread below, feeling grateful for the distance and perspective that my new elevation provided both literally and figuratively. The next morning, I called Dr. Chen at the Smithsonian to formally accept their proposal for the Walter Henderson collection. The decision felt right in ways that went beyond financial considerations, honoring Walter's memory while ensuring that his life's work would continue to serve educational and cultural purposes for generations to come. I also called Patricia Summers to discuss adding a swimming pool to the house design, thinking about Sophie's enthusiastic questions and the possibility of creating spaces where my granddaughters could visit and make memories that weren't complicated by the tensions between their parents and me. The afternoon was spent working on a watercolor landscape of the view from my living room, an attempt to capture the sense of space and possibility that had become the defining characteristics of my new life. Margaret had been encouraging me to work on larger compositions, and this seemed like the perfect subject, a view that belonged entirely to me, painted with colors I had chosen, in a house I had bought with money that represented my late husband's lifetime of passion and expertise. As I worked on mixing colors to match the subtle variations in the distant mountains, I thought about how Walter would have appreciated the irony of his stamp collection funding not just my independence, but also my discovery of artistic abilities I had never known I possessed. He had always encouraged me to try new things, but practical concerns and financial limitations had made experimentation feel irresponsible during our working years. Now, with security in space and time that belonged entirely to me, I was finally free to discover who I might become when survival wasn't the primary consideration. The painting was imperfect but honest, much like the life I was building one careful brushstroke at a time. The swimming pool installation began on a crisp November morning, with construction crews arriving before dawn to begin excavating the hillside behind my house. I watched from the kitchen window as enormous machines carved into the landscape, creating space for what would become a saltwater infinity pool with views stretching across the Sacramento Valley. The project manager, a weathered man named Carlos, who had been building luxury pools for 30 years, assured me that the finished product would be worth the temporary disruption to my peaceful mornings. "Mrs. Henderson, this is going to be one of the most spectacular installations we've ever completed," he said, reviewing the architectural plans that had been customized to complement the house's modern design. "The infinity edge will make it look like the water flows right into the valley below. Your granddaughters are going to love it." The mention of Sophie and Emma brought a smile that surprised me with its warmth. Since Emma's piano recital, I had been imagining summer afternoons spent teaching them to swim in water that belonged to us rather than worrying about pool fees and guest passes at community centers. The freedom to create experiences without consulting other people's budgets or schedules still felt revolutionary after a lifetime of careful financial calculations. While the construction progressed, I threw myself into other projects that had become possible now that money was no longer a limiting factor. The art studio that Patricia had designed in the basement was taking shape, with north-facing windows and professional lighting that would allow me to paint at any time of day. Margaret had recommended supplies that I never could have afforded during my married years: handmade brushes from France, watercolor paints mixed by artisans in Italy, paper imported from mills that had been perfecting their craft for centuries. "You're approaching this with the seriousness of someone who intends to develop real skill," Margaret observed during one of our sessions at the community college. "Most people your age who start painting treat it as a casual hobby, but you're investing in quality materials and structured learning." She was right. Something about discovering artistic ability so late in life had awakened an urgency to make up for lost time. Every painting session felt like reclaiming years when I might have been creating beautiful things instead of worrying about practical concerns that had seemed so important at the time. The watercolors I was producing weren't masterpieces, but they were undeniably mine in ways that nothing else in my life had ever been. The studio was also where I had begun working on what I privately called the Walter Project, a series of paintings inspired by the countries whose stamps he had collected most passionately. Using his documentation and research as reference, I was creating imagined landscapes of places like British Guiana, Mauritius, and Imperial China, trying to capture the beauty and history that had drawn him to their postal artifacts. Each painting was both tribute and discovery, helping me understand the man I had lived with for 47 years from an entirely new perspective. The Smithsonian Project was moving forward with the efficiency that characterized major institutional initiatives. Dr. Chen had assembled a team of curators, conservators, and exhibition designers who were working to create something worthy of Walter's collection and the financial commitment I was making to preserve it. The planning meetings, conducted via video conference from my home office, revealed the scope of what we were building together. The Walter Henderson Philatelic Research Center will be unlike anything currently available to scholars and collectors, explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, the exhibition design specialist who was leading the visual planning. "We're creating interactive displays that will allow visitors to understand not just the historical significance of individual stamps, but the cultural and economic contexts that made them valuable." The center would feature climate-controlled exhibition galleries, research facilities equipped with the latest authentication technology, and educational programs designed to introduce new generations to the artistry and history preserved in postal artifacts. My financial contribution was funding not just the acquisition of Walter's collection, but also the infrastructure necessary to make it accessible to scholars and the public in perpetuity. "Mrs. Henderson, your husband's documentation is so thorough that we're able to create provenance exhibits showing how individual stamps traveled through private collections and institutional holdings over decades or even centuries," Dr. Chen added during one particularly detailed planning session. "This kind of comprehensive historical record is extremely rare in collecting." As winter settled over Sacramento, I established routines that reflected my new independence while honoring commitments that felt meaningful rather than obligatory. Tuesday mornings were reserved for painting in my studio, Wednesday afternoons for physical training with Ashley, and Thursday evenings for volunteer work at the Sacramento Public Library, where I had started teaching basic computer skills to seniors who reminded me uncomfortably of my former circumstances. The library volunteer work had begun almost accidentally, when I mentioned to Carol, the reference librarian who had helped me research stamp values, that I had time and interest in contributing to community programs. She immediately suggested the computer literacy classes, where my recent experience learning to navigate digital systems could help other elderly people avoid the isolation and dependence that came with technological illiteracy. "Many of our participants are in situations similar to what you described from your research visits," Carol explained during my volunteer orientation. "They're trying to maintain independence while their adult children assume they're incapable of learning new skills." The parallel was painfully obvious. These were people who had been written off by family members who found it easier to make decisions for them rather than teaching them to make decisions for themselves. Every Tuesday evening, I worked with men and women who reminded me of myself. Just months earlier, competent adults who had been marginalized by age and circumstance, struggling to maintain dignity while learning skills that younger people took for granted. One of my regular students was a woman named Ruth, whose daughter had moved her from Arizona to California without consulting her about housing preferences or community connections. Ruth was trying to use email and social media to maintain friendships from her previous life, but her daughter monitored her internet usage and expressed concern about online predators who might target vulnerable seniors. "She treats me like I'm 5 years old," Ruth confided during one of our sessions. "I raised 3 children and managed a household budget for 50 years, but apparently I can't be trusted to send an email without supervision." Ruth's situation reminded me so vividly of my own recent experience that I found myself sharing more personal information than I typically would with casual acquaintances. "Family members sometimes think they're protecting us when they're actually limiting our independence," I said carefully. "The key is proving that we're capable of making our own decisions." "Easy to say, but what do you do when you're dependent on them for housing and transportation?" Ruth asked. "I can't exactly rebel when I need their help to survive." The conversation haunted me for days afterward, forcing me to confront how lucky I had been to discover Walter's collection when I did. Without that financial windfall, I might have spent years accepting the kind of systematic disrespect that Ruth was experiencing, gradually losing confidence and independence until I became the dependent elderly person that Marcus and Stephanie had assumed I already was. As Christmas approached, the question of holiday celebrations became another test of the new dynamics between my son's family and me. Stephanie called in early December with an invitation that was clearly scripted and rehearsed, offering a formal dinner that sounded more like a business meeting than a family gathering. "We'd love to have you join us for Christmas dinner," she said, her voice carrying the artificial warmth that had become her default tone in our interactions. "The girls have been asking about you, and we thought it would be nice to have everyone together for the holiday." I listened to her carefully planned invitation while looking out at my pool, now completed and heated for year-round use despite the December chill. The timing felt symbolic. They wanted me to join their celebration just as I was finishing the creation of space that would allow me to host celebrations of my own. "That's very thoughtful," I said. "But I've already made plans for Christmas this year." The silence that followed suggested that Stephanie had not prepared for this response. In her planning, I suspect she had assumed that a 73-year-old woman would automatically accept any invitation rather than spending the holiday alone. "Oh," she said finally. "What kind of plans?" "I'm hosting dinner for some friends from my art class and volunteer work. People who don't have family in the area." This was true, though the plans had crystallized only as I spoke them. Margaret had mentioned that several of our classmates were facing solitary holidays, and Ruth from the library program had confided that her daughter's family was traveling to visit other relatives without including her in the arrangements. Creating alternative celebrations for people who had been excluded from traditional family gatherings felt both generous and subversive. "Well, maybe you could join us for dessert afterward," Stephanie suggested, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of not being able to report to neighbors and friends that I had spent Christmas with family. "I think my guests might still be here then. But thank you for thinking of me." After ending the call, I realized that declining their invitation had felt empowering in ways I hadn't expected. Instead of accepting whatever level of inclusion they were willing to offer, I was creating my own celebration that reflected my values and priorities. The shift from gratitude for inclusion to confidence in my own choices represented a fundamental change in how I saw myself and my place in the world. Planning the Christmas dinner became an exercise in discovering what hospitality meant when it wasn't constrained by budget limitations or other people's expectations. I hired a catering service that specialized in intimate gatherings, choosing a menu that balanced elegance with comfort while accommodating the dietary restrictions that seemed to affect everyone over 60. The dining room that had felt too large and formal for daily use would finally serve its intended purpose, bringing people together around a table that belonged to me rather than being borrowed from someone else's space. The guest list grew as I extended invitations to people whose circumstances reminded me of my own recent isolation. Margaret and her husband David, who had moved to Sacramento to be closer to their son but found themselves excluded from his family's holiday traditions. Ruth and 2 other library program participants whose adult children had made holiday plans that didn't include aging parents. Carlos, the pool contractor, whose crew would be working through the holidays and had mentioned that his wife was visiting family in Mexico without him. "Mrs. Henderson, this is incredibly generous," Margaret said when I called to invite them. We were planning to spend Christmas watching movies and pretending we didn't mind being alone. Well, now you can spend it eating excellent food and complaining about your ungrateful children with people who understand exactly what you mean. The laughter that followed felt more genuine than any conversation I had shared with Marcus and Stephanie since learning about Walter's collection. These were people who appreciated inclusion because they understood exclusion, who valued generosity because they had experienced its absence. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, with views from my hilltop house stretching endlessly toward mountains that sparkled with fresh snow. I woke early and spent an hour painting the sunrise from my bedroom window, trying to capture the way winter light transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and new. The painting was imperfect but joyful, created for the simple pleasure of preserving a beautiful moment rather than any expectation of artistic achievement. The catering team arrived at noon, transforming my kitchen into a professional operation that produced aromas and presentations worthy of expensive restaurants. I had specifically requested that they prepare everything in my house rather than delivering pre-made dishes, wanting to fill the space with the sounds and smells of celebration even if I wasn't doing the actual cooking. My guests began arriving. At 2, each person carrying flowers or wine or small gifts despite my instructions that their presence was contribution enough. Ruth appeared with a homemade apple pie that she had baked in her daughter's kitchen while they were traveling, using ingredients she had purchased with her own money to ensure she could contribute something personal to the gathering. I haven't baked for guests in 3 years, she confided as I placed the pie on the dessert table. My daughter says her kitchen is too small for entertaining, but really she just doesn't think my friends are worth the trouble. Margaret and David brought a watercolor set that they had selected specifically for my new studio, high quality paints and brushes that represented both encouragement for my artistic development and recognition of my evolving identity as someone whose interests deserved serious support. Carlos arrived with his wife Maria, who had returned early from Mexico specifically to attend the dinner after he told her about the invitation. She said any lady who builds a pool in December and invites the construction crew for Christmas dinner must be someone worth knowing, Carlos explained as he introduced us. The dinner conversation flowed with the ease of people who were genuinely happy to be included in something special rather than grudgingly fulfilling family obligations. We discussed travel plans and artistic projects, shared stories about adult children who struggled to balance their own lives with care for aging parents, and debated whether the current generation was more selfish than previous ones or simply more honest about their limitations. I think the difference, Margaret said during one particularly thoughtful exchange, is that we were raised to believe family obligation was automatic, while they see it as optional. Neither approach is entirely right, but it creates conflicts when expectations don't match reality. David nodded in agreement. Our son loves us, but he also has his own family and career pressures. We can't expect him to make us the center of his world just because we made him the center of ours when he was young. The wisdom in their perspective helped me think about Marcus and Stephanie's behavior in a more nuanced way. They weren't necessarily evil people, but they were struggling to balance competing demands on their time and resources in ways that made generosity feel burdensome rather than natural. My financial independence had removed the burden while revealing how much their support had been motivated by obligation rather than affection. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself relaxing into a role I had never experienced before, host rather than guest, creator of celebration rather than grateful recipient of inclusion. The house felt alive with conversation and laughter in ways that justified every dollar I had spent on furniture and renovation. This was what homes were supposed to feel like, spaces where people gathered because they wanted to be there, not because duty or convenience demanded their presence. Around 6, my phone began ringing with calls from Marcus and Stephanie, probably checking to see if I had changed my mind about joining their family celebration. I let the calls go to voicemail, choosing to remain present with the guests who were actually in my house rather than managing the expectations of people who had relegated me to afterthought status. Later that evening, after my guests had departed with containers of leftover food and promises to make the Christmas dinner an annual tradition, I listened to the voicemails from my son's family. Emma and Sophie had left sweet messages wishing me Merry Christmas and asking about my new swimming pool. Marcus had left a more formal message expressing hope that I was enjoying my holiday and suggesting that we plan a visit soon to catch up properly. Stephanie's message was the most revealing. Gladys, I hope you're having a nice Christmas with your friends. The girls were disappointed that you couldn't join us, but I explained that you have your own life now. Call us when you have a chance to discuss New Year's plans. The phrase, your own life now, captured something important about how our relationship had shifted. For months, they had treated me as an extension of their household, someone whose needs and preferences were secondary to their convenience and budget. Now, suddenly, I had my own life that competed with their expectations rather than automatically accommodating them. The New Year's plans that Stephanie had mentioned turned out to be another carefully orchestrated attempt at reconciliation. She called a few days after Christmas to invite me to a party they were hosting for neighbors and colleagues, positioning it as an opportunity for me to rejoin the social circles I had supposedly been missing during my months in their guest room. It would be a great chance for you to reconnect with people who have been asking about you, she explained. Everyone wants to know how you're doing in your new situation. The invitation felt like a performance opportunity rather than genuine inclusion, a chance for Marcus and Stephanie to demonstrate to their social circle that they maintained good relationships with family members despite the obvious evidence to the contrary. I could imagine the conversations that would follow, friends and neighbors commenting on how gracious they were to include the elderly mother-in-law who had moved out under mysterious circumstances. I appreciate the invitation, I said, but I've already committed to hosting my own New Year celebration. This was only partially true. I had been considering hosting something, but the idea crystallized into firm plans only as I spoke the words. If they could use social events as opportunities to manage appearances, I could use them to demonstrate the reality of my transformed circumstances. Your own party? Stephanie's surprise was obvious in her voice. That sounds like a lot of work for you to handle alone. The assumption that I couldn't manage event planning without assistance was exactly the kind of patronizing concern that had characterized their treatment of me during my months of dependence. They had internalized the narrative of me as someone who needed help with basic tasks rather than someone who had been temporarily constrained by circumstances. I'm hiring professionals to handle the details, I said. I found that having the right resources makes entertaining quite manageable. The party I planned for New Year's Eve was deliberately designed to demonstrate the scope of my transformed lifestyle to anyone who might be curious about my circumstances since leaving Marcus and Stephanie's house. I hired a full-service event planning company that specialized in luxury private parties, creating an elegant cocktail reception that would showcase both my house and my ability to host sophisticated gatherings. The guest list included people from various aspects of my new life, Margaret and other artists from the painting class, Ashley and colleagues from the fitness center, Ruth and friends from the library program, professionals I had met through the Smithsonian Project, and neighbors from my new community who had expressed interest in getting to know me better. The diversity of relationships represented the breadth of connections I was building outside the narrow confines of family obligation. Mrs. Henderson, this guest list represents exactly the kind of eclectic mix that makes for memorable parties, said Jennifer, the event planner who was coordinating the details. You've assembled people from different backgrounds who are all connected to you personally rather than throwing together whoever happens to be convenient. The planning process revealed how much I was enjoying the role of patron and host, using financial resources to create experiences that brought interesting people together in beautiful settings. This felt like a more meaningful use of wealth than accumulating possessions or traveling to expensive destinations. I was building community around shared interests and mutual appreciation rather than extracting experiences from places that existed primarily to serve tourists. As December 31st approached, I found myself looking forward to the party with anticipation that reminded me of childhood excitement about special occasions. The house had been transformed by professional decorators who understood how to create elegance without ostentation, using lighting and flowers and carefully arranged furniture to showcase the architecture while creating intimate conversation spaces. The catering team arrived in the early afternoon, setting up bars and food stations that would allow guests to move freely through the house while maintaining the sophisticated atmosphere that Jennifer had recommended for the mix of ages and backgrounds on my guest list. The menu balanced familiar comfort foods with more adventurous options, ensuring that everyone would find something appealing while introducing them to flavors and presentations they might not encounter elsewhere. By 7:30, when the first guests began arriving, my house felt like something from a magazine, beautifully appointed spaces filled with the energy of anticipated celebration. I had chosen to wear a dress that I had purchased specifically for the occasion, something elegant but approachable that reflected my evolving sense of personal style now that I could afford clothes based on preference rather than practicality. Margaret and David were among the early arrivals, bringing champagne and obvious excitement about experiencing the house they had heard me describe during art class discussions. Gladys, this is absolutely stunning, Margaret said as I gave them a tour of the main living areas. You've created something that feels both sophisticated and welcoming. Ruth arrived with two friends from the library program, women whose circumstances reminded me of my own recent experience with family members who struggled to balance care with respect. They moved through the house with the wonder of people who had forgotten that beautiful spaces could be accessible to them, touching surfaces and admiring views with appreciation that felt deeply gratifying. Dr. Chen from the Smithsonian had flown in from Washington specifically for the party, bringing her husband and treating the event as an opportunity to see the personal environment of the woman whose collection was funding their ambitious new research center. Mrs. Henderson, knowing you in this setting helps me understand Walter's sensibility in entirely new ways, she said as we stood in my studio looking at paintings inspired by his collection. There's an aesthetic coherence between his approach to collecting and your approach to creating that makes perfect sense now. As the evening progressed, I moved through my own party feeling like someone I had never been before, confident, generous, surrounded by people who valued my company. For reasons that had nothing to do with obligation or convenience. Conversations flowed from art to travel to literature to philanthropy, with guests discovering shared interests and making connections that would outlast the evening. Around 10:30, my phone began ringing with calls from Marcus and Stephanie, probably checking to see if I was available to join their celebration as it wound down. I glanced at the caller ID but didn't answer, choosing instead to remain present with the 60 people who were actually in my house, celebrating the year that had transformed my life in ways that still felt miraculous rather than simply fortunate. At midnight, as champagne glasses were raised and resolutions were shared, I found myself thinking about Walter and how proud he would have been to see his life's work funding not just my security but also my emergence as someone who created joy for others rather than simply accepting whatever happiness was offered to her. The year that followed would bring its own challenges and opportunities, but standing in my own house surrounded by people who appreciated my company, I knew that whatever came next would be faced from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. I had learned the difference between being supported and being managed, between family obligation and genuine care, between existing at other people's convenience and creating a life that reflected my own values and capabilities. The woman who had sat in Marcus and Stephanie's guest room counting food stamps was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that dignity came not from other people's approval but from her own choices and the courage to live according to her own definition of what life should include. The confrontation came on a rainy February afternoon when Marcus and Stephanie arrived at my house unannounced, their faces carrying the determined expressions of people who had rehearsed difficult conversations and convinced themselves they were ready for any response. I watched through my kitchen window as they sat in their car for several minutes, apparently gathering courage before walking up the stone pathway that led to my front door. When the doorbell rang, I was in my studio working on a watercolor of Chinese landscapes inspired by Walter's imperial stamp collection. The painting was nearly finished, with delicate washes of blue and gold that captured the serene beauty I imagined in places Walter had never visited but had preserved through his careful collecting. I set down my brush and walked upstairs, taking my time to let them wait while I considered what this unexpected visit might represent. "Mom, we need to talk," Marcus said when I opened the door. His voice carried the forced authority of someone trying to reclaim control of a situation that had moved beyond his influence. "Can we come in?" I stepped aside and gestured toward the living room, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the valley that never failed to remind me how far I had traveled from the guest bedroom that had once contained my entire world. They settled uncomfortably on my expensive furniture, looking around the space with expressions that mixed admiration with something that might have been resentment. "This is quite a place you've built for yourself," Stephanie said, her tone carrying the artificial pleasantness that had become her default whenever she discussed my transformed circumstances. "Very impressive." I sat across from them and waited for whatever presentation they had prepared. The silence stretched until Marcus cleared his throat and began what was obviously a scripted speech about family relationships and mutual understanding. "We've been thinking about everything that's happened over the past year," he said, avoiding eye contact while reciting words that sounded rehearsed rather than heartfelt. "About the misunderstandings and communication problems that created tension between us." "What misunderstandings?" I asked. Stephanie leaned forward with the earnest expression she used when explaining obvious things to people she considered slow to comprehend. "The whole financial situation, the food stamps, the way we handled your living arrangements. We realize now that we should have been more sensitive to your feelings during a difficult transition period." The phrase, difficult transition period, was carefully chosen to reframe months of systematic disrespect as a temporary adjustment that everyone had handled imperfectly rather than acknowledging the fundamental problems with their approach to family relationships. "What specifically do you think you should have done differently?" I asked. Marcus and Stephanie exchanged glances, apparently surprised that I wasn't immediately accepting their general apology and moving toward reconciliation. "We should have been more collaborative in our decision-making," Marcus said finally. "More inclusive of your preferences and concerns. And we should have been clearer about our own limitations instead of making you feel responsible for budget pressures that weren't really your fault," Stephanie added. I listened to their carefully worded non-apologies while looking out at my garden, where spring flowers were beginning to emerge despite the February rain. They were attempting to acknowledge problems without taking responsibility for the attitudes that had created those problems, offering process improvements rather than fundamental changes in how they viewed family obligations. "What do you want from me?" I asked directly. "We want to rebuild our relationship," Marcus said. "For the sake of the girls, if nothing else. They miss having you as part of their daily lives." "And what would that rebuilt relationship look like?" Stephanie pulled out her phone and opened what appeared to be a notes app, suggesting that they had prepared specific proposals rather than simply hoping for emotional reconciliation. "We were thinking about regular family dinners, maybe once a month. Holiday celebrations where everyone feels included. Shared activities with the twins that don't require anyone to feel awkward about financial arrangements." The specificity of their planning revealed how much thought they had put into managing our interactions rather than genuinely repairing the damage they had caused. They wanted predictable access to me without having to address the fundamental disrespect that had characterized their behavior when they thought I was financially dependent on them. "And what role would I play in these family activities?" I asked. "Whatever role feels comfortable," Marcus said quickly. "We're not trying to control anything. We just want everyone to feel like family again." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with them presenting various scenarios for managed reconciliation while I asked questions that forced them to confront the superficiality of their proposals. They wanted the appearance of family harmony without addressing the trust that had been broken or the power dynamics that had made their disrespect possible. Finally, I stood up and walked to the window that overlooked my pool, where heated water created steam that rose into the cold air like visible proof of luxury that existed for no one's benefit but my own. "I need you to understand something," I said without turning around. "The problem wasn't that you had budget limitations or communication issues. The problem was that you treated me with contempt when you thought I was powerless to leave." "We never treated you with contempt," Stephanie protested. I turned to face them and pulled out my phone, opening the voice recording app that still contained documentation of their attitudes and plans during my months of dependence. "Would you like to hear recordings of conversations where you discussed moving me to assisted living facilities while I was using food stamps? Where you calculated the cost of my grocery consumption down to the penny while planning weekend trips to wine country?" The color drained from both their faces as they realized that I had been systematically documenting their behavior rather than simply enduring it with grateful silence. "You recorded private conversations without our knowledge," Marcus said, his voice rising with indignation that would have been laughable if it weren't so revealing of his priorities. "I documented my own experiences in my own temporary living situation," I corrected. "And those recordings confirm exactly what kind of people you become when you think someone has no other options." Stephanie began crying then, silent tears. That felt more like manipulation than genuine emotion. "We were doing our best in a difficult situation. We never intended to hurt you." "Your intentions don't matter," I said. "Your behavior does. And your behavior revealed that you see family relationships as transactions where support is exchanged for gratitude and compliance." The truth of that statement hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished with apologies or good intentions. We all knew that I was right, that their treatment of me had been based on assumptions about power and dependence that they couldn't deny or explain away. Marcus made one final attempt at salvaging something from the conversation. "What can we do to make things right? There has to be some way to move forward." I sat back down and looked at both of them with the clarity that comes from understanding exactly who people are when they think consequences don't apply to them. "You can accept that I've built a life that doesn't include you," I said. "You can explain to the twins that families sometimes grow apart when people reveal themselves to be different than everyone hoped. And you can stop pretending that this is something that can be fixed with better communication." They left without further argument, probably recognizing that no combination of words or promises was going to restore relationships that had been built on assumptions about dependency and gratitude that no longer applied to our circumstances. That evening, I called Emma and Sophie directly, explaining that I loved them but would need to see them separately from their parents until they were old enough to make their own decisions about family relationships. The conversations were difficult but honest, acknowledging that adults sometimes disappointed each other in ways that couldn't be easily repaired. 6 months later, the Walter Henderson Philatelic Research Center opened at the Smithsonian with ceremonies that attracted collectors and scholars from around the world. I gave a speech about Walter's passion for preserving postal history, surrounded by exhibits that transformed his life's work into educational resources that would inspire future generations of researchers and collectors. The twins visited me regularly that summer, learning to swim in my pool and helping me tend the garden that had become my favorite creative project. We made new traditions that belonged to us rather than trying to repair old ones that had been damaged beyond restoration. Marcus and Stephanie occasionally drove past my house, probably checking to see if I had changed my mind about reconciliation or forgiveness. But the woman who had sat in their guest room counting government assistance vouchers was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that dignity came from her own choices rather than other people's approval. I never used those food stamps. They remained in my wallet as a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change and how important it was to pay attention to who stood beside you when you thought you had nothing left to lose. The stamps weren't worth $50 million each, but they had taught me something priceless about the difference between charity and love, between obligation and genuine care. Some stories end with forgiveness and renewed family bonds. This one ended with boundaries and self-respect. With a woman who had learned to value her own worth more than other people's comfort. Walter's collection had given me financial freedom, but choosing how to use that freedom had given me something even more valuable, the knowledge that I was strong enough to walk away from people who only loved me when they thought I had nowhere else to go. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.